we're very happy to open this lecture series, the Arguments Lecture Series with Marco Ferrari. As you know, the Arguments Lecture Series is a fundamental part of the AAD program. It's a debate-based program that it's bringing together people that are discussing architecture from other disciplines and other fields, and people that are discussing architecture from the field, and seeing the way their boundaries can be pushed, and the way architecture gains relevance not only as an interdisciplinary or as let's say as an introdisciplinary discussion, but also gains relevance in the world or in the worlds. The structure of for those that are not familiar with the AAD Arguments Lecture Series, this is a program that basically is prepared a week before we have this session by people that are, all of you, that have been reading the text and the references that Marco Ferrari in this case sent, and then you all, or most of you have your questions ready and will be complemented with what you hear today. The structure is basically Aaron White today, one of the AAD Arguments instructor, is going to introduce Marco Ferrari, then Marco will do a presentation, and then Chris Cowell, that is somewhere around here, will be responding together with Aaron White in a debate that will be soon open to all of you. So I would totally encourage you to take notes and to prepare your questions and your comments for the afterwards debate. I'm really happy that Marco Ferrari is here today in GSAPP. He's making, or he's bringing together design with geography, with politics, with technology, with ecosystems, and with many of the changes and geopolitical and climatic tensions that are shaping our discussions now, our lives and our futures. And I could not think of a better person to start this discussion on the relevance, on forms of relevance for architectural practices than Marco. So Aaron, please, if you want.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, welcome. So just a few remarks to introduce our guest, Marco Ferrari. 2 years ago, at an event not unlike ours here today, our guest Marco Ferrari characterized his formation as a practitioner in the following way. I'm going to quote you now. Quote, "I've been trained as an architect, which for me is very important because architecture gives one the background for being able to connect different practices and for being natively transdisciplinary." Now, I don't know if native transdisciplinarity was before or has since become a part of Mr. Ferrari's lexicon, but I found it useful. I found it to be a useful concept in relation to understanding his work this week. I take it to mean something like being at home in or belonging to the place of movement across disciplines. I guess it might also mean transcending disciplinary boundaries, but given Mr. Ferrari's tendency to concretize the seemingly abstract and then to stay tightly focused on the resulting particularities, I doubt this very much. It's a wonderfully suggestive term, and as I guess all internally duplicitous terms must be. Native, of course, denotes just the kind of immanent belonging, seemingly at odds with the sense of movement and even displacement called to mind by the prefix trans. Despite this opposition, both terms refer to the disciplinary, which here seems like it can't just mean discipline, because as soon as the transdisciplinary would become just another discipline, it would lose its critical edge. Yet nor can it just mean disciplinarity, meaning it cannot just be a not discipline or a non-discipline, since then one would lose the sense of moving across. One needs the boundaries in order to move across them. And so in some sense, I take this tension to be animating certain aspects of Mr. Ferrari's work. I should admit that I, of course, am making more of this concept than Mr. Ferrari did 2 years ago. His, in fact, was a mention made in passing, and this almost dissuaded me from bringing it up today. But then it occurred to me that one of the crucial things that seems at stake in the work to me is the idea that meaning is actually to be found more in the movement across, in passing rather than in situ. More often created in the movement across disciplines, formats, media, and professions than within them, perhaps. While by his own admission, Mr. Ferrari's time at the University of Venice and then the Architectural Association in London was crucial to the work that would follow, that work has not been of the kind typically associated with the professional architect. Rather, Mr. Ferrari has undertaken a series of interdisciplinary, and we might even say intermedia engagements with a wide range of institutions, formats, and practitioners. His firm Folder has exhibited work at the Venice Biennale, the Oslo Architecture Triennale, and the Milan Triennale. He has worked with architecture and design publications like Avatar and Domus to reimagine the media of contemporary architectural discourse, and collaborated with luminaries like Bruno Latour and Tomas Saraceno to realize projects that call into question design's relationship to politics in a variety of locales and at a variety of scales. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Marco Ferrari.
Thank you so much, Andres, for the invitation, and Aaron for this overwhelming introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. So I start giving you some context of our practice. So I'm the founder, together with Elisa Pasquale, of Studio Folder, which is a small design and research studio based in Milan that we initiated 6 years ago. We do lots of commission design projects, working with institutions and other artists and architects, and a few let's say, autonomous work, which is what I'm going to talk to you today. I would say that our research practice has been so far an unorthodox approach to some theoretical issues around representation and cartographic visualization. The lens through which we observe these issues are visual narratives that let us understand contemporary topics. These narratives often pivot around what I would call the graphical objects, and this is like sort of a term I would like to unfold over the course of this lecture, which means objects made of lines and numbers. And these objects, for the powers of restructuring information around strong metaphorical concepts, are able to shape the way in which we measure and interpret our world. So I would say they were not particularly interested in maps as such, but the particular way in which they offer a hint to the nature of these graphical objects. If we were to make a quick history of cartography throughout modernity, Adam Curtis style, we could say that we moved from a time in which maps were mostly the result of an oral transmission of knowledge, being physically embedded in architecture, and the fact that they were embedded in architecture, like in this image from Palazzo Farnese, emphasize the way in which they symbolize political power in a very explicit way, I would say. So we move from that condition to the use of cartography as a sort of scaffold for information produced by other sciences, mainly observational sciences. The map becomes the atlas, embodied into a portable object, a movable object, a book, that symbolizes the drive toward exploration of the 19th century. So the understanding of nature becomes three-dimensional for the first time, we could say. It goes beyond the Cartesian surface of the planet into the atmosphere and down to the ground, with the first visualization of atmospheric phenomena in the geological depths. A clear idea of the planet emerged, one in which everything is connected through lines, colors, and numbers. A few years later, it becomes evident how the work cannot be described anymore by looking at just the natural domain. The human intervention is now completely entangled with the representation of the planet. So lines represent not just the climate or the distribution of natural species, but networks and infrastructures. In this case, Herbert Bayer's Atlas for the Container Corporation of America is a startling example of the 20th century understanding of the world as a global, equal, even platform dedicated to capital's expansion. Of course, with the advent of the first photograph taken from space, even if we all know that the blue marble, the photo that NASA distributed after the Apollo 17 crew came back to Earth, is not the original one, it was not actually this one, but the one that was flipped, in which the South Pole was put on the bottom of the image. Anyway, with this image, the lines seem to disappear completely. to give space back to nature with a planet free of human alteration. But we know that somehow this was just a temporary technological limitation. Remote sensing will quickly evolve in order to being able to convert this image of of apparently pristine ecosystem back into visible lines, number, and colors. So the abundance of data produced by remote sensing in the last few decades made very clear how more data didn't mean a better understanding of reality, at least not at the public level, at the public discussion and debate. We have more data, but the visualization beyond scientific applications often lacks the clarity to present the social besides the technical, and to represent the variety of the different human understanding of our planet. So somehow the idea of having like too many data that is symbolized here with this image, like this snapshot of the entire internet done in 2003, allows us for a highly detailed, very accurate yet illegible representation of the planet. But also produces like two interesting trends. On one side, we became fascinated with complexity in a very aesthetical way, in a very superficial way, I would say. This aesthetics of complexity is completely pervasive nowadays, and migrated from scientific visualizations to everyday's media. On the other hand, this aesthetics of complexity is complemented by a rhetoric of simplicity. So this introductory video that I took from Apple Worldwide Developer Conference in 2013 exemplifies how the need of simplified narratives take advantage of the same visual language of lines, numbers, and diagrams, but just as an empty shell, to serve an idea of unproblematic complexity, not to actually explaining anything. So how do we go back to use lines in a more meaningful way, in a more accurate way, I would say? How we can look at this object of research through the optical capabilities of visual design and architecture in order to unfold complex dynamics. I put like this image as a sort of like a final globe of this sequence of globes. This is the work of Mark Lombardi, which for us has been always a reference and a beacon, both in terms of language and content. In terms of language, because we need information design, and we need the capacity of visualizing data in order to understand the patterns of our complex world without losing accuracy and detail and information, but also because we also should take care of the content. So what we actually look at, what we actually represent is very important. So the first project I would like to talk to you about, in which we tried to somehow apply this glance toward the planet, it's called Uncharted. It's a project that we first presented at the Oslo Architecture Triennale 2 years ago, in which we, after the invitation of the curators and the After Belonging Agency, we wanted to understand how the pipeline of production of contemporary cartographic images is carried on nowadays. So we were not much interested in the satellite technology itself, so the way in which satellites work, but in the infrastructure, so both technical but also political, that was behind it. How satellite data are managed, where they're stored, how the world is sensed, why images are stitched in a particular way. So we said that the graphical object of this project is the mosaic. So the idea of like that we can create like a whole image of the planet, not just with a single shot, but like thousands, hundreds of thousands of them. How this is actually done and achieved. So we believe that by looking at these images and doing documental research, we could somehow give a more granular and truthful representation to the idea that the globe is constant, is not a single shot. It's not like a simple image, but it's a very complex object of analysis. In order to do this, we started a research by looking maybe like the most obvious history in this field, which is the Landsat program. And of course, the Landsat is a kind of banal also, I would say, object to look at, because it's been the longest running satellite program of remote sensing ever done by humanity. And also because it's been like the standards through which still contemporary cartographic and satellite images are calibrated, let's say. And And also because Landsat, being the actual real first global scale infrastructure, posed since the beginning incredibly interesting questions that are still nowadays, we could say, unsolved. First of all, it addressed for the first time the problem how we deal with an immense amount of data that are produced in real time. Because Landsat, like quite paradoxically, in the first 2 decades, was producing much more data than the one that could be processed. So the idea that somehow nowadays the planet became a sort of like a global scale computation machine, the Landsat was the first embodiment of this. On the other hand, the main questions that the Landsat raised was about the sovereignty of data. Because being literally the first global and overarching technology, but was still property of a single country, but being able to produce data of all the other countries of the world, the issue was who owns this data? So who is going to be able to see this data and to manipulate them? So after trying to frame this interest, we looked at how Landsat worked, and we started to collect, let's say, all Landsat data open, so they're freely available on the internet. So we started to download like a few samples of them, and we focused not on the images themselves, but in the metadata of the images, because again, like we wanted to see not just the evolution of the object of observation, so the planet, but the way in which these images could tell us about how the infrastructure worked. So we look at the metadata and we produce this visualization, which is just like a very simple superimposition of many different layers, in which we took every single shot taken by Landsat and positioned geographically. So the darkest areas of the map shows where the Landsat took more images across 45 years, so from 1972 to 2016. So the first things we realized from this image was that, let's say, the eye of the Landsat over the planet over the course of this long period of time was not equal, was very different depending on geography, depending on different places. But of course, this image tells nothing more than this. So like it's a very general consideration. So we did, the second operation we did was divide these layers by ear. And divided by ear, we got like much different image. So we started to see that like depending on which year we were looking at this metadata, the map of the planet had a lot of differences. It was like a very different maps every time. So if we could look at the sequence of these images in which each of these maps is just all the metadata of every image taken by Landsat divided by ear, so there are 45 images, we can see how this frequency and the distribution of this data changes over time. So somehow this image was a sort of a breakthrough because it states like on one side a simple thing that like the observation of this machine is not being the same. We don't know for which reasons. For sure, it's like for many different reasons, for technological evolutions, political focus, environmental issues, different decisions that over the course of 45 years brought us this image. But also this sequence of images state very clearly that, again, the planet is never been sensed at the same time. It's always like a composition of images in which beyond geography, time is very important because it corresponds to a political context in which the same images have different values. So we decided to give a visualization of this information, not in a, let's say, digital way, a dynamic way, because really we wanted to compare all the different years. So we started to build some globes. So we put together like, we actually transformed our studio in a manufacturing of globes. And then we designed systems in which we could be able to transfer this data into a spherical surface, very analog, I would say, things. Which the most difficult part of this project was to find the right pen in order to be able to write all these 45 spheres without the pen to dry. And then when we had like all of them done, the final result looks like this. So you can actually see the different density of this data depending on the different regions and the detail which you can sense the distribution of these images. Then we built like this frame, which was a very simple structure that allowed us to keep the comparison between the globes and at the same time seeing them all at the same time. So this structure was organized in lines, so 9 by 5, all the 45 years, and the spheres were rotating slightly, like very slowly, in order to, each sphere was completing one revolution every 99 minutes, which is the time that Landsat orbits around the planet. And then this structure was accompanied by a table in which we displayed some other data, parts of the research, which I'm going to show you now. So we call this structure, this visualization, a panoptic cartography of remote sensing. The idea that somehow we could revolve the glance of the satellite back to itself by looking at this archive. And then the rest of the project, the rest part of the visualization, we call them a footnotes to the atlas, because somehow we realized that when we open Google Maps, and we always see this very smooth and regular and beautiful and colorful image of the planet, it's very difficult to see the kind of the bottom bar of the interface where the source of the data is actually displayed. So if we're going to look at that more closely and unfold what these acronyms and what these names means, then we can understand more about how the atlas is composed. So the other visualization were about how these actual images in Mosaic is put together. So we just built, let's say, a first idea for a catalog of aberrations, I would say, a catalog of errors, in which we selected some screenshots, some shots taken from Google Maps, in which we could see at different latitudes how data from, let's say, vector shapefiles, which determines the distinction between land and oceans, and satellite images are put together. And then also in these other screenshots, we could see from different resolutions and the geometry of high resolution tracks of the seafloor how actually these data are produced, which means they're produced by ships that travels like commercial routes or scientific exploration routes, and they collecting the data, they also share it with Google. So just by looking at these images, we could somehow reverse engineering the process by which they could be put together. And then the final visualization was a three-dimensional model, these three-dimensional models, in which we tried to visualize what we called the sky of Google Maps. So somehow these models are vertical sections of specific areas taken from Google Maps, in which we zoomed out by 70 kilometers from the ground. So each of these layers is 1 kilometer in distance, in vertical distance. And then we divided each of these screenshots by the source of the satellite image. So, and then we connected all of them vertically. So basically we could see how the space, the cartographic space of the sky of Google Maps, of the zooming space of Google Maps is not like a smooth three-dimensional space, but it's composed of a mosaic of very different satellite sources. Because of course, like different satellites are used for different resolutions or sensing different phenomena. So this project was more like, rather than like a complete investigation of a topic, was aimed more as producing props for discussions. So visualization is a sort of propositions that could be used to understand and debate particular phenomena. The second project I would like to talk to you about is called Italian Limes. And this is a project we started in 2014 and is still ongoing, in the sense that we're now doing a book trying to wrap up the research we've been doing these past 4 years, and also amplifying expanding the debate around the topic it raises. So this project is a project that we started as a studio and involved like many other people as collaborators over the course of these 4 years. And it's a project that talks about the borders of Italy. But also is a project that talks about another graphical object, which in this case I would say that is the drainage divide. So something that I will explain later. Basically, this sort of graphical abstractions that says decides where the waters of different rivers distributes over a continent. So this project started in 2014 on the occasion of an invitation we got to participate to the Venice Architecture Biennale, in which we were asked to propose a project that was about one place of Italy and a particular topic connected to it. So instead of looking at a specific place, we decided to look at the border as a device. So the border is a spatial but also architectural device. For different reasons. From this image, you can see that the border of Italy, when I say border, I mean the terrestrial border, not the maritime borders, is a very evident one, we could say, because it has been always historically considered a natural border because of the mountains. But also because we wanted to understand, let's say, less geographical, more political dynamic of the relationship between the internal border of Europe and the external borders of Europe. So after 1995, with the Schengen agreements that declared that the border of the neighboring countries of Europe were open to the flow of people and goods, we transitioned from a situation like this one, in which the frontiers of the countries of Europe were always defined by an architectural device. So like a building, a custom, a place where you were asked to present your passport, to something like this, in which like any kind of physical materialization of the border almost disappear. The only thing that reminds you that you're crossing a national border is the sign over there, the traffic signs, which says you about the different traffic regulation between different countries. So somehow, like this, the comparison between these two images kind of suggests the idea that the borders in contemporary war disappear. So at least, like in the privileged part of the contemporary war where we used to we live in Europe, almost disappear. But if we look at the map of Europe, these borders never really disappeared. So what's the relationship between what we see in the territory and what the actual maps still say? So is this like just a rhetorical argument, or is this like a good political, like a sort of a movement versus like a better political situation? Also, the northern border of Italy is quite interesting from an historical perspective for two reasons. Because somehow it was the Alps, and especially the northeastern part of Italy, has been always a laboratory to understand how the idea of national sovereignty of European countries evolved between the two world wars. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of this region, the South Tyrol region, but somehow is a very violent history of, let's say, internal colonialism within Europe, and because this region that is historically and culturally part of the German world was taken by Italy after the First World War, and then became like a very hard and violent process of colonization. So basically of trying to populate this region with Italian population. And of course, because this process was very long, these regions started, was the place where a lot of discussions of where to trace this border happened. So in this map, which is from 1915, just at the beginning of the war, shows like different lines at different colors in which they were according to different principles of where the border should have been. According to, for example, ethnicity, the distribution of population from different cultures, language, where different languages were spoken, or the watershed, the drainage divide, like what we could say like a natural division between territories. So this part of Italy, this part of Europe became like really a sort of like, like a really laboratory for understanding these topics. So what we did was, in order to start the research, we went to a particular place, which is the military archives of the National Mapping Agency of Italy, which is part of the army. It's called Istituto Geografico Militare, which means Military Geographical Institute. Because as architects and designers, we were not cartographers, so we decided to understand how the border was traced in the first place. So we went to this archive, which, as you can see from this shot, is not like a proper archive. So documents were not indexed. Even the people that were working there didn't know what they had in the archives. It's a military and private archive, so it's totally not open to the public. And by looking at the materials in this archive, we started to trace a history of how this alpine territory has been looked at in order to be measured from the second half of the 19th century, when Italy became a sovereign independent country, to nowadays. Of course, like this research was about like different different concepts of the border, but also like different meaning of how this territory, this landscape was visualized. And again, like very importantly, the evolution of different technologies through which this territory was measured. So the Alps were a laboratory for understanding how to trace a border, both in terms of like national sovereignty, but also in terms of cartographic technology, because the Alps were very remote, also because we were difficult to reach. And before there were like a technology that could allow people to look from above and so sense the Alps from a plane, basically, the measuring, the trigonometrical work that was required to measure the land was very complex and difficult. So this image, for example, is from the 30s and shows the way in which between different peaks you had to clear the view in order to be able to measure the distance and then fix some trigonometrical points in order to then to have like a framework where you could trace the line of the border. The documents in this archive are very different and varied, so they're not just maps. They're photographs, documents, fieldwork diaries like these ones, in which there is an amazing like glance, like a sections of 50 years of work, because like 50 years is the time that the Italian state took to measure its whole territory for the first time, is described in a very technical terms, but also like in terms of the population and the social issues. So the life of the surveyors and the people that actually lived in the land and crossed the Alps for many months of the summer is recounted in these documents. And of course, tracing the border means building architecture. So building these lots and lots of structures that materialize the presence of the border in the land. The border has always been like visible in the territory, but also were allowed the people to see different points from afar. So the border had to be transformed into a visible and stable feature of the terrain, we could say, in an attempt to try to stabilize it and make it evident also to the enemy or to the other countries. This is a collection of other documents. So, for example, each of the 4 borders of Italy, so the one in France, Switzerland, Austria, and Slovenia, was traced in different times, depending on the relationship and the wars that shaped the diplomatic relationship between the countries. So each of the documentation of these 4 borders is very different, and again, like witnesses the evolution of technologies. So, for example, in the documentation of the French-Italian border, which is all done with these like panoramas of the frontier, it's very interesting how this eye over these ridges and mountains tries to normalize this idea of a line, this idea of being. There is a specific point, there is like a difference, there is a ridge, and that is the border. So how can we read the landscape in this sense? So the evidence of the border from the landscape. This documentation is not just a study of the border, it's the actual document, the official documents of the border. So these documents are the ones that still nowadays constitutes the official representation of what the border is, because the border is basically built as a few thousand boundary stones, so like physical elements which are embedded in the terrain, and their coordinates which are stored and archived, but also the visual documentation that describes the line of the border between the points. So the landscape is actually made low through these drawings. Then, of course, there are maps. So maps is quite interesting because the atlases of the border, the maps that shows how the border, the coordinates, the numerical coordinates were translated into a visual representation of the terrain, vary a lot over time. So for example, there are these stunning examples of the border between Italy and Yugoslavia from the 50s, in which we have this very detailed and accurate representation of a piece of land across the border, to one like this one, in which is the official documentation of the Austrian-Italian border, which was done in the 70s, in which the technology completely changed. So in this case, the line becomes a very abstract representation in which there is no territory at all, because there is the representation of new methodology in which just the points were important. And of course, like when GPS arrived, all this effort of measuring by hand with analog technology the border had to be done again. So this is the first machine, the first GPS instrument that was owned by the Italian army, the one that was used to recalculate all the trigonometrical points of the country into digital coordinates. So again, these are images from the archives that shows this work. And these are images that show the points on the border, how they were sensed with GPS technology. Until we get to the most recent way of representing the border, which is through satellite images. In this case, we have these images because the border between Italy and Yugoslavia kind of changed name in the 1995 and became the border between Italy and Slovenia. So the Slovenians were not allowed to take the documentation from Belgrade, so they had to redo the whole official documentation of the border. So this was done with the satellite images, and it's kind of interesting because in 1995 was still quite difficult to get like all the images of a certain area without clouds. So in this case, we have an official document which should show with high precision an area where the line passes with a cloud on it. So I think it's a kind of a interesting and almost absurd image that shows the problems that we have with progress of these technologies. These documents are all stored in cabinets. So if I would say what the border actually looked like officially, I would say that the border is 4 cabinets. These are 2 of them. This is actually the actual documentation. So a copy of these documents are stored in Italy, and like in the neighboring countries, the same copies. So this is always like the official reference. So when we finished doing the research, we came across one interesting anecdote, so one interesting fact, talking with the surveyors and cartographers of the States, which is about what they call the mobile border. So in recent times, in the last 10 years, because of the climate change, we all know that alpine glaciers are shrinking a lot or disappearing completely. And this caused some problems in cartography. Because as I said before, the border of Italy mostly runs at high altitudes over the Alps and mostly coincides with the watershed line. The watershed lines, because of this altitude, often runs on glaciers. So because this glacier moved and changed geometry, also the geometry of the watershed lines changed a lot over the course of the past 10 years. This image shows how the watershed was being highlighted and being observed in the 20s. So trying to understand where these slopes were changing directions and so determine what the border was. And this is what the border looks like nowadays. So this again is not an image we produce, it's an official document that the geographers sent to the government to explain the problem, and shows how the border, which once was running on the glacier that was running above these mountains, when the red line, Confine di Stato, national border, when this glacier retreated and disappeared, the new border became this yellow line, because this ridge is now the highest point, so basically became the new border because it's the new watershed. So you have to imagine that this problem happened hundreds of times across the entire border. This is another examples of it. showed on a satellite image, in which you see that the previous border, which is a dashed line, the red line, was running like as a curve across these glaciers, where the new line, which are the blue dots, are the measurements of the new watershed. So they realized that when they went there to see what the border was, the watershed was not anymore this like simple line, was a more varied geometry. So again, this is like a more zoomed out view of a stretch of the border between Switzerland and Austria, in which you see how this condition is very widespread. So somehow we could say that the border is like runs through an archipelago of glaciers. So what happened? Because the border always have to coincide with what you see in the terrain, the geographers suggested that instead of updating cartography, we could update the law. Because somehow the law, before this new law of the mobile border, said that every time a state changes its border, the same amount of terrain that one state gains have to be give back to the other state. So doing these kind of diplomatic agreements across hundreds of times over the border would have been like a disaster, like very, very demanding operations. So the Italian government proposed a law that was approved by the parliament and then also signed by Switzerland and Austria, in which they changed the definition of the border. So there are some excerpts that I translated from the official discussions on the parliament, which is interesting because they say like climate change at high altitudes have modified the physical evidence of the boundary line. So because of climate change, the boundary moved. As a result of noticing this problem, the Commission for the Maintenance of the Swiss-Italian border has decided to introduce a new notion of frontier, the so-called mobile border. So like a completely different idea and concept which almost, quite funnily, destroys the idea of the border itself. These are images of the first campaign for the survey of this border. So this law that was approved in 2008 caused that there was a new measurement of the border. So it was a huge campaign of actually retaking all the measurements. And these are some comparison we did between glaciological campaigns in the 30s and then in 2012, different ways in which measurements are taken. Okay. So when we found when we came across this news, which for them was again, like nothing major, and also we never heard about this. Initially, we thought it was just a glitch. So like an interesting, funny anecdote, maybe connected to the Italian tendency of spending lots of money on really meaningless problems. But after this, we kind of realized this was actually the pivotal, let's say like a very important fact that could allow us to convey and discuss all the different problems, all the different issues we were looking at. First of all, climate change, and the way in which the disruptions that our tampering with the climate is bringing to every field of human activities, especially like ones that we thought was not affected by this, like political borders. Secondly, the way in which we observe the land, which observe and interpret the territory, but most of all, the relationship with technology. Because somehow we realized that without the very precise GPS measurements that allowed us to sense and measure and represent the movement of these glaciers, the whole problem of a mobile border couldn't exist. So somehow we were bound by technology, by very precise technology, to give account of a movement that otherwise no one could have seen. So not only climate change, but the union of these two things. So we decided the project we started to do then was to try to visualize this in real time. So try to visualize how the border was moving almost in real time, because like to stress this idea of like high mobility of the border. So we decided to do to build like a network of sensors. So like some devices that would be able to record and transmit the movement of the glaciers in real time. So this is an internal view of the sensors, and this is the actual device that we built. And then we installed them on the glacier. So we did like a campaign, in spring. So we chose one of the glaciers across the border, one that could allow us to work because it's fairly flat and also quite reachable. And then we went there with a team of hybrid team of very different people. So scientists and glaciologists that helped us to frame the scientific part of the project, and then architects, and then a journalist that came with us to tell the story. Again. And then we installed a network. And so the system we envisioned was sort of like low poly, like a low resolution grid across the border. This is a diagram that shows the way in which we deploy the different sensors across the glaciers. So we divided into two teams, like a red team and blue team, and then we installed all the 25 points. This grid has a width of almost 750 meters. And the border runs across it. So the idea was that with this sort of low-resolution grid, we could be able to understand the geometry of the surface and then be able to see where the watershed was moving. And these are some images of the sensors installed on the mountain. The grid is quite big, so it's almost impossible to see it from the photographs. We could just see like a few of the sensors at the same time. It's like an image taken from the helicopter when we left the glaciers and showed the position of some of the sensors. So these sensors were designed to transmit in real time their position every hour. So each of these 25 sensors was transmitting through a GSM connections, like a string of data with some environmental data and then its positions. And then when we started receiving the data, we designed the system, the machine that was able to represent it. So we decided to do like a drawing machine in order for this machine to be able to download this data and automatically draw a line based on the coordinates it was receiving. So this is an image of the first prototype. Again, like a first prototype. We decided to do a pantograph as a sort of a reference to the first machines we saw in the Museum of the Instruments of the National Mapping Agency, because these machines, these pantographs, were the first one that were used to translate into isolines and altitude lines, the first images of the Alps that were taken with the planes. So these machines were the first one that were actually able to draw precise maps of the Alps. This is the final image of the machine in the installation. So the machine was just was doing one thing on request of the users. Just they start to draw, and then draw the line based on most recent coordinates received from the sensors, and then timestamp the map. So every map produced by the machines every minute was actually the most updated one, technically. So actually, the only one that was at that moment valid. So every map somehow discarded the previous one. And then another object we produced for the installation was a three-dimensional model of the mountain. This again is an image from the archives of the agency, which shows the way in which once upon a time three-dimensional models of a territory were done with an analog CNC machine. Nowadays, these things are done in completely different ways, so through DTM models. So this is a render of the DTM data of the same region, of the same glacier where we went. And this image, I think, is quite powerful and interesting because the way in which this image is produced is a collage of two different sets of data. So at these altitudes, every point that is above 2,000 meters is collected during summer. So during the day of the year in which there is less snow, so that the radar can scan the actual territory and the actual surface. Every point that is below 2,000 meters of altitude is taken in winter, so when there is less foliage, in order to be able for the radar to penetrate and then reach the ground. So this, which is supposed to be a very accurate and very precise representation of the territory, is completely fake landscape. There is no such landscape as the one represented by this image. So with that file, we created like a physical model with a CNC machine. And then we use this model to project some images that show, like in a dynamic way, how different cartographic representation of the same area evolved over the last century and how this mobile border was behaving. So this is the final layout of the installation itself with like sort of a table. We like doing tables, which all the different objects were showcased. And so the model, a central glass box with a selection of historical documents from the archives and the drawing machines, and then the maps that were fed to the drawing machines. So to conclude, I think we should go back to study understanding lines. So first, before much more than borders, I think Italian limbs is a project about natural lines, so the drainage divide, and the way we can measure them. So this image was taken last year. There's not much information on this image online, but basically it's about research that a Chinese professor from Tsinghua University is doing now. For the first time in 2017, he was able to test a peculiar type of stove, this one, based on portable chip technology derived from rocket engines, for cloud seeding at high altitudes in the Tibetan plateau. So this is the first prototype of a very ambitious project by the Chinese government. There's an aim to catch the rainwater that gets stuck on the southern slopes of the Himalaya and basically make it rain on the glaciers in order to discharge all this water on the glaciers and then reuse them on the northern side of the Himalaya. So basically, it's a sort of we could consider it a sort of an attempt to shift the watershed line, not at the ground level, but at atmospheric level, by using cloud seeding. So shifting the atmospheric drainage divide by design. Of course, like cloud seeding is nothing new. It's a technology that has been regularly used since the 70s, for example, in the Sierra Nevada in California, to deal with drought. But in the Chinese project, the scale is a completely of another order of magnitude. And of course, it has to do with a long-term state project about displacing this watershed, migrating this watershed. So moving potential rain, something that is not actual rain yet, from neighboring states to its territory. So I think somehow that also by looking at not just by looking at our project in the Alps, by looking at these potential new investigations, this particular type of line, the drainage divide, is not just interesting from an historical perspective, but is a very contemporary object of investigations because it is central to many issues of the near future. So how can we think how can such an abstract geographic features can be a way of understanding at large our environment and our planet? Because somehow how such a very simple but powerful mathematical concepts and abstractions can tell about the way in which we organize information and arrange our intervention on the physical territory. And I would like to close with this image, which again is about lines. This image is taken from an essay by Sebastian Grevsmuhl, which is an historian of science, and analyzes the way in which the very successful metaphor of the ozone hole has been created by NASA scientists in the 80s and 90s, with their decisions to display the data they were collecting with isolines. So the data they had available from the measurements in the Antarctic zone was not very widespread. That was not like as homogeneous as this image let you believe. So were not like very well distributed or complete data. But somehow the choice of representing them with isolines stand for the assumptions that these data were uniform and they were behaving the same way across a very, very wide regions of space. So somehow the concept of the ozone hole was created not because of the actual measurements, but a decision of the way in which these data were represented. And of course, the ozone hole we could consider like one of the main, the first, let's say, natural catastrophe, like the first embodiment of the Anthropocene that became like the forefront of the environmental policies in the 90s. So it was the event that the first time moved like a lot of political decisions about addressing the environment. So again, like the isoline, which is a mathematical concept widely applied in the representation of natural sciences, is an incredibly powerful tool of assumption. It superimposes on the world and then normalizing eyes of the instrument. by evening out any exceptions that may stand from the higher values. So I think like by looking at these objects, the mosaic, the watershed, the isoline, we can unfold stories and unhinge ways of thinking reality that are long overdue. These graphical objects that expresses visual metaphors drive scientific exploration and political decisions, and they clearly show the circular influence that representation operates on reality.
In the tradition of arguments, whoever introduces the speaker also asks the first question. And there would be so many points. Thank you, first off, thank you for that. The breadth of that is really amazing. There would be so many points to touch down into that work. And I mean, one question, which is not my question, but would be how you decide to intervene. You know, the moment, the case studies you choose, how you choose to intervene in these kind of enormous issues. But my question is really, I want to go back to the, especially Uncharted in the Italian Leames, in the your actual produced exhibition. I don't know if that's what you'd call it, but I wanted to hear what you had to say about. It seems like in both those projects, and in the work more generally, there's a kind of state of affairs that's under analysis. You're investigating it, you're researching it, and then you are telling us about it. But then there's a kind of it seems like a will to go further, to not just tell us about the condition, but to actually reproduce the condition in the project. So you're not only telling us about how a border gets drawn, but you're redrawing the border over and over and over, and making a machine to redraw the border. And so it seemed to me when I was looking at these projects that there are these systems that you are investigating of like how the border gets drawn, which you are telling us about, but then you're reproducing those systems in a way that seems to me to challenge our kind of traditional notions of representations on one hand versus models on the other. And I think one reason I was thinking of this is I think in the Rankin, Graham Burnett's work on orreries, models of the solar system, in a moment in which those are understood to be representations, and then a moment when they shift. They're kind of epistemic status shifts, and they are not just representations of something else, but they're actually reproducing the behaviors of the system they describe. Is this a way you think about your own work? Is it a kind of demand that you insist upon, that you move past a representational logic to a moment in which you are kind of literally at a smaller scale, at an increased scale of legibility, but nevertheless reproducing in this less representational and more model way your object of analysis? We'll have to share this, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a super interesting question. Yeah, I think that there's a sort of tension between the idea of representation and models. The choice of doing that kind of performance in the Italian Limes installation, I think originated from different considerations. So, like a very simple one was about that some of the border is actually retraced over the course of the history of a state. So the border is never like a very stable device. So it has to be maintained, which is quite interesting because the actual role of the agency, the geographical agency, is to maintain the border in the first place. So the idea of actually being able to translate the landscape through certain specific instruments and according to certain specific processes normated by the law is a ritual that gets done again and again and again. So we wanted to display that in a very paradoxical way. Somehow this machine could trace the border every minute. Then there was this idea of being able to give to the object of representation itself the power of representing itself. So somehow these machines would be able to put the glacier as an epistemological object, being able to trace its geometry. So being able to showcase its movement without human interventions, which again, like, it's a sort of reflection of the idea of objectivity. But again, it's like once the system and model is put in place, then is the glacier actually moving, representing its own movement or not? And then the idea that somehow that seeing this line being traced was a comparison between the actual map that was blank and the blankness, the whiteness of the snow. That like it's not just an aesthetical reflections, but somehow was connected to this idea of like the visibility of the border that is quite strong when we have to measure a border, but it's technically invisible, like on a glacier. So, and again, like this was very interesting because in our conversation with the surveyors, we asked, how do you actually see the watershed? So how can you actually be able to see the watershed on a surface that is basically flat? And they say, but we walk there and we see where in summer, you know, there's like the ice melts, and then some rivulets of waters go in one direction, some in the others, and then we point our GPS, which is a sub-centimetric precision machine to measure this watershed. So there's sort of like completely short circuit about like a lack of precision of the observation, which is of course like very natural, and then this super high precision of the instruments, which transform into low as a feature of the landscape, which is inexistent basically. So
sorry, I am going to pass it over, but that's even very interesting to me because the imprecision of that, like determining the watershed, allows for at least the fiction of a precise border to be maintained. Yeah. But then your own drawing machine, which is incredibly precise, through the multiplication of the boundary, renders it ambiguous. The thing that ought to be singular, why should it be possible to do a potentially infinite number of versions of a singular thing? So I think this is very interesting, these kind of exchanges between the inherent ambiguities of certain systems becoming rendered precise, but then opening up other ambiguities within them.
Yeah, and also like another thing that I think our system and installation wanted to seem precise. So even like the kind of the way in which we built the technology that we used, kind of mimicked the precision of like very precise tools. We tried to make them precise, but then the way in which we represented this line on a map on a scale of 1 to 3,000 with a very imprecise pen. So once again was this sort of like way of saying like the precision is like a completely something that we shouldn't even exceed at a certain level. No? Like it's not like a matter of discussion in these kind of topics. So like a sort of inner contradiction of the language we were using.
Just the one microphone. Okay. I wanted to. I had a few thoughts, but one of them that really is now intriguing me, is coming to the fore, is the idea of the line. Even more precisely, the concept of limes itself, the origin of the word from the Roman surveying methods. I dug in. I took a book out from the library on Roman surveying techniques, and how interestingly it slips on different registers. The limes was the surveying lines of the Cardo Decumanus from the Groma of the Agrimensor, and it spread across. So it was like the setting out lines of a survey. Word limit comes from limes, and limit have the same roots, but it also meant the boundary of the Roman Empire. It was a political edge, and yet the Romans knew that the line was a fiction. The line was not real. It didn't exist. And because it wasn't a physical thing, it was a conceptual thing. It had always had a sacral or sacred quality. So I'm very and the boundary that we see across the Alps is a very ancient. That, as you mentioned, the very ancient boundary between the Republicans era Roman Empire and the North, and Hannibal famously breaks that boundary. So I'm just very interested to know the haunting of that story, the limes. You chose this word, obviously very clearly for this project, and it really plays off against the other project in Oslo, the Uncharted. It's almost like they are an oppositional pair. One is about no precision at all, or the vagary of a whole period of time of satellites looking from high above, and the other is this almost the absurdity of precision, where precision is almost the ridiculousness of the debate between an ice floe and where it moves. I'm wondering, in your head, do you see this project as a spectrum in which neither side offers a solution, but it's all the politics comes down to scale? And where does the nation state lie in this politics of scale? Because the Rankin text that we encountered offered a journey in which the nation states are compromised through war to move towards an international space that's mediated and universal, the UTM, the Universal Transverse Mercator, which you sent us the text of. Are you proposing that this is a reverse or a haunting of an old, the spectre of the nation is coming back? Is it just to do with scale, or is it just to do with this particular project of environmental shift? Where do you see this, not just in the environmental precise example here, but in other geographies, other spaces where borders are dealt with? Is there a return of the precision of the nation state that seems to kind of thwart the project of mapping in this wider global system? In other words, I'm asking you the question of the politics of internationalism versus nationalism. What do you see is playing out here between these two projects you've set up?
One thing, like from the first part of your consideration, is about this presence of the line, which is for me is quite interesting because, especially in the Alps, and that like historically and naturally, even if we know that there's not a natural line, has been always considered self-evident because of the mountains. But this line becomes more clear and precise the more you go to the center of the state, and the more you go away from the Alps themselves. Because somehow the idea of the border is very precise in Rome, or like in the places where, from the Roman Empire, but also nowadays from the central power, where the states needs that line to determine sovereignty. But the more you go close to the place itself, this line disappears. So in the actual history of the Alps, and those specific regions specifically, there's never been a line. Actually, the line has always been a problem. Somehow the local population had to deal with, and it completely contradicts any kind of everyday life habits or rituals that they do. So, yeah, for sure, like inherently the border is just a very political necessity that underlines the particular peculiarity of the state that is originates from last century conceptions. In terms of I think like the difference between the two projects is of course about scale. The somehow like the Italian Limes project goes like very, very much deep into the centimeter scale of understanding one specific topic and then using this to unfold a global perspective. And I think it helps us to understand also other dynamics that could be visible to other places of the planet that have like similar situations. For example, like in the Andes or in the Himalayas, where there are actually literally similar dynamics that will unfold in the next decades, which there are borders, national borders that are contested, for example, between Chile and Argentina or India and Pakistan, that are contested because they're a consequence of colonialism periods in which this border were traced imprecise or in a situation that didn't take into account the evolution of the territory itself. So what will happen in those regions in which there are no peaceful relationship between the countries? So how can we apply this kind of same methodologies in those regions which conflict is actually evident and visible? So I think it will be very interesting to study with the same approach, with the same documental archival approach, those areas to see what's been the history of those borders.
May I
Yeah.
just a quick link on to that question is the question of precedent. Does this set up a precedent with the European Union on regards to the mobile border? Was this something that was unilaterally or bilaterally agreed between, say, Austria and Italy, that this definition of border can change? Or is it something that has to go through a federal space as well, federal clearinghouse, which is the European Union, to agree that this as a principle can be applied to other member states? Is there a tension in these scales, in other words?
No, but it would be amazing if it could happen, because somehow, I mean, legally, it's just an agreement within the two countries, so there is no like European Union-wide regulations that says like there's some specific regulations between countries that to be applied to the whole union, right, or enforced to the whole union. This is just a case of like mutual agreements between the two countries. There are separate agreements actually as well. But I think like this could be a precedence in the sense that could actually explain how to deal with this, with the relationship between ecological processes and let's say national sovereignty. Somehow, I think it's on one side the mobile border definition is a very technical solution. So when we talk with the surveyors, for them it's nothing special. Yeah. For them, like it's just a very effective way of dealing with lots of work, because for them otherwise would have been like really painful to attend like countless diplomatic meetings in which they had to negotiate for the movement of the border for a few hundred meters. While these definitions kind of takes away all this work and just acknowledges the evolution of the territory. On the other hand, it could be like could have a much wider impact on regulation if we could adopt this to not just glaciers, of course, but any kind of border, because, I mean, rivers move, terrain moves all the time, so there's no glaciers, because now are moving so fast, it's just show them more clearly, but there is no solution of continuity between glaciers and other geographical regions or objects. So I think like the potential of this definition could be much, much wider.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions. Are there microphones? Yeah, there's microphones. So just like raise a hand. And if other people with questions can make it known, we can kind of just keep the microphones circulating. But yeah.
So I'm interested in this idea of authorship. I wonder if you can expand a little bit more on, I think you brought up an interesting idea of giving voice to the glacier to kind of represent itself. So I'm wondering how you approach these projects, approach your own role of authorship in comparison to kind of the machine, and then of course to the objects that you're trying to kind of give voice to or represent.
I think it doesn't have a relationship with my idea of authorship in particular, but I think like it's a reflection of our faith in machines in general. It's somehow like the idea when we have models and we have systems that take into account the ability of measuring, of sensing information, producing them, and processing them and reproducing them, we kind of tend to detach from them. So we can rely a lot of responsibility to systems in general. So playing with this idea of being able to reproduce these automatic behaviors lets us understand that these are not like simple processes. So it's just more a way of, again, stressing this idea that we should not let infrastructure, I wouldn't say without human intervention or without like being legible. So just a way of making machines and systems more legible and the way in which they act.
So my question is, there's an interest in borders, and why should we be interested in borders? I think that borders define a territory, and not solely as a geographical area, but also as a bounded space that it's under a specific jurisdiction. So I think, and hence, they create an identity. But you have shown that borders are now moving, and in some cases blurring. So how do you think borders are reshaping our concept of identity?
Oh, it's a difficult question. I think that the main point here is to, so of course, like borders are like a very important topic nowadays because they're becoming harder and more widespread. So I would say, like, if I had to synthesize the whole aim of this project, is that we should get rid of borders at all, like completely, because like the moment in which, the more we try to define them, the more this operation becomes meaningless. So in particular, like the question of identity is that, so identities always are across borders, and every border region that we see, we know that there is like a sort of like cross-border identity that has always been historically there. So borders has been all the time, even like in the Alps, that we could say like there's been a border since the beginning of modern times, a violent operation, or completely like a political, abstract operation of trying to set up the power of a distant sovereign to a region which didn't have anything to do with it. So, yeah, I don't know if I responded, yeah.
It's a very interesting lecture. I really liked it.
Thank you.
My question is, from the readings that you sent previously, there seems to be a pattern of the discontinuity between the way that we measure the world and the way that we represent the measurements that we take from the world, and how those two things don't necessarily correlate. I wonder if it is pertinent now that we have a new way of surveying the geometry and geography of the planet to stick with a previous way of representing it in a flat manner, and should we and will we ever get to the point where we have a general virtual representation and a more accurate representation of the world? Is that clear?
Yeah. I think we are already, when we think about the atlas as a way of synthesizing the way in which we see the world, I think nowadays when we think about the atlas, we think about digital platforms. So geography became like just a sort of a mathematical space in which we can attach any kind of layer of information. So Google Maps is not just a satellite, like a mosaic of satellite imagery, it's just basically an API. So like a system in which we can geo-referentiate and coordinate like many different informations. Of course, like this is a very powerful tool, but at the same time, it kind of lacks the possibility of selecting this information. So if we look at like different atlases that have been published, designed and published from the 19th century to the last decades, we can analyze through these atlases the main many other different aspects of the context where this publication was produced. So about the political situations, about the status of the development of science, the way in which economy and capital were shaping the global cooperation and other things. So I think the need, the possibility of having like static images of static representation of geography is very important, because somehow push us towards editing and selections. While the idea that somehow geography is like now is like a constant and up-to-date in real-time measurement and reproductions without any kind of editing in the middle is very problematic for me. It's a very powerful tool in terms of like, because it produces data all the time and allows like certain particular subjects and corporations to manipulate them and use them, but at the same time, from the point of view of the public, is a very, very dangerous tool.
But aren't you also saying, and I think this was one of the points of the Rankin text, that something like accuracy refers to a whole set of uses, ambitions, aims, and that you're not going to have any accuracy outside of an understanding of the politics within which which certain uses are prefigured by the forms of representation. So it's not that they're accurate or inaccurate, but they're accurate for.
Yeah, for
X.
something. Yeah, for certain purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so to understand the representation, you'll have to understand the whole set of ambitions and uses it's embedded in.
I was saying to my group that it reminded me of how a dog owner often looks like their dog in the regards to, say, the Second World War mapping, how the British interests were strips of lines that related to the whole across Europe, and it was described by Rankin as messy. But he said compared to the UTM of the US, which had a different ambition, it was regionally very effective. And so it struck me that it reflected the ideologies on the ground or on the air, so to speak, of the political powers that were creating these systems. In regards to, I don't think that's changed. And so in regard to the technologies, you always have to get rid of or cut away certain values, say literal values, like for instance loss of internal angles to get precise distances, or the precise angles and you lose real distance. So it seemed like what you select and choose in your cartographic toolbox is actually a reflection of your own ambitions as a nation state or as an international commission or as any body. That's in a way kind of, I think, what I was asking as well before, but it seems to come to the fore in your work as I see it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like the fact that there's no one single line of progress in technology actually expresses this. No, the fact that there is no like a single development or accuracy, because again, also like the idea of accuracy is not is like objectivity. We could say no, it's not like one single gradient between two statuses. More accuracy, less accuracy, is always has a purpose. Or is always driven by what we need to do with that kind of accuracy. So of course the history of the UTM grid, or then the GPS also, is particularly explicit towards this, no? Because then it kind of aligns with a particular view of why we need the kind of like in-between regional and global accuracy in order to deploy, for example, military control of a region.
So these questions are interesting right now because it leads to my question. I think there's a point in which there's an understanding in the text that the mapper has agency over what needs to be represented based on the motive behind it. In light of that, would you say that your work is then an attempt to relinquish that agency over the act of mapping? And if so, is there a danger to that in terms of the political act of creating borders, and not and also in terms of the profession, the role and the agency of professionals to create borders?
I'm not sure I got the question right. So you mean that if this work is an attempt of regaining responsibility to the figure of the map maker? Or
I think
no?
It's more of like, is this work an attempt to relinquish responsibility, much in the same way that you left it up to have nature draw itself in the
relinquish in the sense of giving, taken away. Okay. No, I would not say that. In the sense that, like, my interest was more trying to unveil a process rather than reflection upon the responsibility of who is what's the role of different historical professions compared to the evolution of technology. Many people, when we presented this project in different venues, said. So then you're actually reinforcing the idea of the state drawing its border. Of course not. We're trying to do the opposite. And also, like, we're not actually saying that we could actually build a system that could measure the border and then make all the surveyors, not needed anymore. Of course, this system is unfeasible in reality, so it's paradoxical by definitions. But also, it's not the point in the sense that we will always need, human design to understand these dynamics. So no, I don't think this is the point actually.
Some back, yeah.
You mentioned that that through your work you hope to get props for discussions. So I was just wondering if you had like any repercussions already, or what did you hope to achieve specifically? That the way that you decide to represent your work is like through exhibition and is very public. So I was just hoping to see if you already had like some sort of response to all of it.
The response has been the possibility to debate it in venues like this, for example, which for us is very important to unfold all the different layers of discussions that can stem from the project. I think the aim of this is to help focus the global debate in the architecture and design field towards certain topics and certain methodologies. That I think the kind of the power that architecture as a discipline has, I think Eyal Weizman defined it as the optical capacity of architecture to see space and see certain dynamics of a space should be focused on relevant topics. So it should not be used as a general understanding of just the methodology by itself, but should be really focused on what we think from year to year, from age to age, really meaningful to the society at large. So I think in our work, besides the methods and the tools and the kind of visual language that we try to structure, and the aesthetics that we try to develop, is always about really trying to deal with things that we think are important on many different levels. I think also there's a reflection in the field of information design that have become very fashionable nowadays. So we see a lot of visualizations everywhere, no? Because I'm really, what I said at the beginning, I'm really worried about this fetishism of complexity, of complex representations, because I think it's really destructive towards the real problems we're going to face. Of course, climate change is one of them. So I think just by focusing on the content of these things is very important, and saying that these very powerful optical devices, optical tools and methodologies have to be focused on certain problems and not others, maybe.
But it also seems like, if I can push you on that a little bit, it also seems like you're trying to do, you're doing much more than just framing. And I think, because one could take the answer you just gave as a kind of apolitical answer. Like, we don't have any agenda here, we're just putting it on display. We're hoping, and we're just, but I think there seems to be a desire on the projects to bring the viewer to a kind of crisis moment in which some of the concepts they had about the world are confronted with the embodiment of those concepts, and the two cannot be mapped onto one another, if we continue with the mapping analogy. I mean, these would almost be kind of aesthetic effects that you're trying to, one could describe the projects through. The infinite number, I'm still stuck on the infinite number of Italian borders, and the sublime effect of the infinite or something. Of these systems being made evident to one, of being embedded in systems, so that that the map maker never had the agency we once ascribed to him or her. He or she was always already embedded in systems, which that sense that one gets by being by those systems being made legible, made evident in one's place in them, not to relinquish, but to be made a part of. Those seem not just like impartial framings to me, but a real situating of an observer in relation to the phenomenon.
Yeah, now maybe that's like an amazing point, especially because of the this importance of being able to situate each of the figures within like a wider understanding of the mechanism and the context. I think most of all, our work is a statement that we need to take care of the context all the time. Not in the sense of the architectural context, but like in the sense of like there's no limit to the depth that you can actually go into to understand more broadly like certain dynamics. So, of course, there is a limit at which you have to stop because you cannot continue to research like all the time. You have to make sense and explain to the people. But somehow, like the more connection you're able to create, and the more you can create this sense of crisis to the observer. I think like the sense of crisis like is something we should never escape. Only like thinking about crisis we can understand something. Otherwise, there's no other way of making sense of reality than just crisis. So, of course, then there is like an agenda. I think, as I said, like Italian Limits is a project that is against border all the time and in a very clear way. But somehow we feel that if we just say this, it kind of loses a lot of its potential. So, especially because it's such a heated political topic, that just by throwing yourself in a discussion with a clear statement like this, you kind of lose a lot of agency.
Hi. So I was just wondering, with the projects that you've shared, Uncharted and Italian Lines, you're kind of drawing attention to the borders that have been created or exist. Even if you look at the Uncharted project where you show the kind of surveillance that happened from 1972, that map clearly shows us that North America and Australia are the areas that had the most surveillance. My question is that if the general idea is to talk about a world with no borders, wouldn't it be more prudent to kind of emphasize on the similarities that exist between different regions instead of focusing on the differences?
Similarities, you mean?
What I mean is, for example, that image that you showed of the entire globe, right? Mm-hmm. That idea of kind of oneness. Are there other ways to do that? Can we do that? Is there a project that could make it seem as if it was a world with no borders instead of emphasizing the differences? So is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Okay, I'll try to answer with that. So I think in this sequence of images of the Uncharted project, the more we go towards the present, so the more data we have, the more invisible these differences become. So because the more data makes like the difference between the different regions of the planet invisible, because like they are mapped all the time, like much more frequently, because the technology improved and the data transmission improved and stuff. So somehow like less data allowed us to show these differences and see how this fragmentation of the planet emerged in the early times. Then we, of course, we all knew that the United States and Europe and Australia, for some reasons, were the most mapped. But then also there were other highlights. For example, like in Western Russia, or of course, like the Middle East and Iraq, and of course, these mappings, like this increased mapping activity over those regions, happened like in the years that. Somehow coincided with other events that happened. For example, like the Chernobyl area was more mapped during the nuclear incident, and then the Middle East during the Iraq War. But we decided not to pinpoint, not to point these events, or not to make direct and evident connections between the density of the images and like other historical events, because somehow we wanted to let free this interpretation in the sense that Landsat is such a complex project. It sounds like a widespread and like historically long project that there could not be a single reason why the satellite looked at a specific place of the planet in that year. So it's like always like a series of reasons, like a number of reasons that accumulated and made that output. So in this case, we decided not to be precise and not to really highlight these differences, but just to give an idea of these fragmentations. So to let the users just wander around and think about just the layering of the different reasons behind such a huge project that involved many different institutions, many different people with lots of different agencies over the course of 45 years. So we didn't want to give like a simplified version of it. So somehow, I don't know if I answered, but.
My question is, where your project questions the stability of the border through its moving position, why doesn't it question the concept of the line as it divides the things into two? And then my next question is, if you still believe the border condition is a line or a field, because the line is invisible, for example, Austria dividing with Italy, it's invisible, but what actually exists is a field, like the land.
Can you repeat
Like
the first
buffer,
question?
like
Sorry, I didn't get the first question. Also, I don't see where you are.
Here.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay.
It's very strange.
Okay, so where your project questions the stability of the border through its moving position, why doesn't it question the concept of the line as it divides the things into two? And this other part of the question, hope I'm not losing you, if you still believe the border condition is a line or a field, for example, Austria and Italy are divided by an invisible line, but what actually exists is the field, the buffer.
So I think like the project destroys the idea of the line, doesn't really reinforce it, in the sense that it kind of tried to say that like the most we try to define the line as a line, it's impossible, so it kind of destroys it. In terms of like, I think the border nowadays, there are many different border conditions that we can study, and we see more and more that the line that doesn't count anymore. So the border became, because of different technologies that are used to monitor and to filter the transit of people and information across borders, the border becomes in different situations like an area, an archipelago of different areas, and even like completely unrelated to the physical presence of the border itself. For example, there is like a very interesting case, I think it was told like in an essay by James Bridle about the policies of the Australian government to regulate the migrations of people from the Southeast Asia to Australia, in which the Australian government used an island far away from the border to detain these people. Then through phone interviews, they would try to understand through the accent of their voice where they were come from in order to regulate the inflow of migrants. So in this case, what is the border? The border is like the accent of the language, so it's not even like things that we can geographically determine. Or for example, in the United States, there is like an area in which police can enforce border regulations, which is far beyond the actual line of the border.
On the south.
On the, yeah.
Particularly, right?
So, the kind of topological images that we can use to describe the border really are different from situation to situation. So I would say it's never a line. Anyway, what seems to be like a line so precisely determined, it kind of disappears.
We're nearing the end of our time, but I would just say one of the things that your work seems to do is really challenge the idea that there would be any way to go out and actually find what was there. You know, what actually exists, and a kind of infinite deferral of that, and looking at the multiple mediated ways in which the actual is produced. That seems to me to be both the possibility and the necessity of taking up these issues politically and in dialogue together. And so thank you for allowing us to share in that dialogue with you today. If you'll join me in thanking our guest, Marco Ferrari.
Thank you.